Hey everyone, this is David, and I wanted to make a quick little video about something that we talked about in class earlier this week, which is basically how to mat this image of a hot air balloon off of its background um, from the sky that it's on, right? And so we're going to talk about how I would do this, right? And there's a couple of different techniques that you can think about in order to help us get there. But mostly the most important thing about this is for us to kind of understand the concept of how matting in After Effects works, particularly luma matting in After Effects, so that we can use this image to cut itself out, essentially, right? Because like the challenge with this image has to do mostly with these really fine lines here that, no matter how steady your hand, you're never going to get them out perfectly, right? And so with like a paintbrush in Photoshop or with like a pen tool or something, right? Because they're gonna, either you're gonna be too precise and they're gonna look too straight and impossible, or they're gonna be too jagged and janky. And so we're gonna see what we can do to get to make this work, right? But I first want to just talk about really quickly, just to make sure that everyone has the same understanding here about what a luma mat is in After Effects, right? And so just for the sake of easiness, I'm going to make a red solid, right? And then I'm going to call this image, right? And sometimes what I do when I'm just testing something out is I'll come to my effects panel and I'll drop checkerboard on it, and then I'll drop a solid composite, and that essentially, if I change the color of this now, is going to essentially just give me a backdrop that I can use to troubleshoot on, right? So maybe this is like my red background, so it's got some image data, so it's not just totally red. That's totally just something that I do for myself, but it might help you too, so that you can kind of see what's going on. And then I'm going to make a new solid. I'm going to call this one matte, right? And for the sake of easiness, I'm going to just put a ramp on this guy, or a gradient ramp is what it's called, which is just your standard black-white gradient. And then to matte these images, all you have to do is you have to come down here to this track matte column, and if you don't see this track matte column, you can just come down here to this expander collapse, the transfer controls panel, and if you click that, it'll toggle on that as well as your little blending mode thing here. So you once you have this column visible, you then click here and you can choose which type of matte you want to do. And just so that we can first start talking about it, is I want to make this to a luma matte, right? And you can see what happens here is that this kind of weird gradient gets applied to my layer here, but it's not actually a gradient, and you'll be able to see that if I turn my transparency on, right? So if I turn my transparency on using this little button down here, you can see that the top of my image is actually entirely transparent, and it's a gradient going down to full opacity down at the bottom, right? And that's because the way that a luma or luminance matte works is that it looks at the layer above it and it says, where that layer is white or 100% white, I will be 100% I will be 100% opaque. And where the layer above me is black, I'm going to be 100% transparent or invisible, right? So you'll notice that where that gradient is black, this is see-through. I can see the transparency under it, and where that gradient is white, it's not see-through, right? I have my checkerboard background that I made there, and so that's cool. That's basically the basics of how to use a luma matte, and then you can also just come here down to luma matte and say inverted, and all that does essentially is flips the way that the equation works, right? So now wherever is black is going to be totally opaque, and wherever is white is going to be totally transparent, right? So now I'm totally opaque at the top where it was black, and transparent where it was white at the bottom. But I'm going to leave that on regular luma matte so that we don't get messed up for right now. But the one thing that I want to talk about is what happens if I move this gradient, right? And you might be saying, you might know the answer already because you can see, but when I turn it off, what you'll notice is that it actually just cuts that whole part of alpha into alpha, right? It considers all of this, where on the above layer, and if I go ahead and solo that, there is nothing, right? It considers all of this the same as it considers black, or the transparent part over here, right? So that's a really important thing to remember, is where there's, if you have this set to a luma matte, right, it also kind of works as an alpha matte in a way, right? Because if I put this to alpha matte, you're going to see the same thing, right? Is that everywhere that this gradient isn't is going to be transparent, and everywhere that it is going to be totally opaque, right? So the alpha matte is essentially like a more basic version of the luma matte, because the luma matte is going to first look at the alpha for that layer, and then it is going to look at the luminance data, the white-black data, right? And so that's what we're going to be using here to, I don't know why I'm clicking that, that's what we're going to be using here to isolate out our image, right? Is that we're going to be leveraging both the luma and the alpha properties in order to get this kind of cut out, right? And so the theory of this whole thing is that we're going to basically try to duplicate this image, which I'm going to do now, and I'll do the same thing that I did there before, is I'll call that image and I'll call that matte. And I'm basically, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and put enough effects on this layer, this matte layer, to make everything that I want to keep solid black and everything that I want to lose solid white, right? And then that's essentially going to create my inverse luma matte for ourselves, right? And just so that we go back here, one thing to remember is that if I use the inverse luma matte, right, the luma matte inverted, you can see that this is now going to be totally opaque, right? It's going to treat everything that's black or transparent in this case, right? There's nothing here. When you have a luma matte inverted, it's going to treat everything that's black or transparent to be totally visible, and then everything that's white to be totally transparent, right? So, okay, cool. So we're going to come back here and we have my image and we have my matte, and then some basic effects that you can use to do this. And we're going to just throw a couple on there and see what works best. But this is going to be hopefully helpful to some people. Is what we're going to do is we're going to first put on threshold. And what threshold does basically is, I'm going to turn it off so you can see the difference. But what bit threshold does, and also, by the way, when we're working with black and white images and looking at mattes, it's always really helpful to have your info palette up, because that way you can mouse over and you can see the value of your the pixel that your mouse is currently on, right? So this pixel is 239 in the red, green, and blue channels, and 255 in the alpha channel. And so what threshold does basically is it says that anything under this luminance value, anything under 128, so if I mouse over and I find something that's under 128, right, like 54, that is going to get turned into black, and anything above it is going to be turned into white, right? And you can scrub this little guy different ways to give you, you know, higher, lower quality. And you can start, it's actually kind of cool, right? You can start to see a lot of the compression of this photo, where there's, you know, subtle blocks of color that are like 1 or 2 luminance values away from one another, right? And so you can see here that, like, this, for instance, gets pretty close, right? Like, we start to be able to have a lot of black where we want to keep things, and a lot of white where we don't want to, right? And then obviously there's all of this stuff down here, but we can use just like a simple mask to clean that up, which we'll do in a little bit. So okay, so what we're gonna do, that's the first one, is threshold. The next one is like threshold 2.0 in a lot of ways, which is if I come here to my effects palette and I search for levels, right? Excuse me. And what levels does, right, is it's your standard Photoshop levels, and you essentially have input values and output values, right? And what that means is that this is the range of color in color or luminance, right? This white one is luminance in your image. And this is how much you want to be allowed to export, right? So hopefully that's a little confusing, but here's an easier way to understand it. If I move this value up to, I'm just going to come here and enter a value of like 128. Basically what that says now is that everything that used to be totally black or 0 is now mapped to this much smaller range, right? So essentially you have to imagine if this entire range of data was now essentially scrunched into these values, right? So you can see everything that was really dark now became medium gray. And that's what you'd expect, right? Because this is a perfect medium gray, 128. So everything that was perfectly black before is now going to be 128. And we can actually demo that by making a solid and making it totally black, right? And then coming here and copying my levels effect and pasting it on there. And you can see when I mouse over it up in my, you guys can't see my info palette, my bad. Up in my info palette here, you can see that when I mouse over it, that it's 128 value in the red, green, and blue channel, right? And when I turn it off, right, it's going to be 0. So I'm mapping that 0 value of black on the input to 128 on the output, right? Which is, and then the same thing works for doing it the other way, right? Is if let me delete this levels effect for now, come to this black solid, and if I make it, excuse me, if I come to this black solid and hit Command-Shift-Y for solid settings and change it to white, right, and then I put levels on top of it, I can also map my output whites to get grayer and grayer and grayer and grayer and all the way to dark, right? So this in a lot of ways is exactly like the threshold, except it gives you values of gray instead of the black and white. So, and so let's go back and look at that image really quick. If I delete this, I come here and let me reset this levels, right? What I can do first of all is that in this case, I don't actually want to mess with the output, gradient here. I want to mess with the input because I want to basically say like, take everything that's under about 50% gray and map it to all black, right? And then if I pull this in, it's going to say, take everything that's above whatever percent white this is and make it totally white. So you can see that I'm taking out a lot of the contrast in my image that way. And so this is why this is like threshold 2.0, right? Because I get all of that same control about where my black and white points are going to be, but I can manipulate the gray values in between them too, which is great, right? And so here you can see that I'm getting a lot of really nice contrast between the background and the foreground here. And the other thing that you can do is this is your gamma slider that just basically, again, you can imagine just taking this spectrum and like pinching it one way or the other. But you can use that gamma slider to start to really isolate or control where your midtones are. And so you can see that immediately we have a lot more clarity in those lines, right? And then what you could do, for instance, is now you can start to throw threshold on top of it. And if I bring that down, you'll see that I'm starting to get some kind of thicker lines. And you can see if I turn this off, you'll see what happens is that just gets totally changes, right? And so you can start to layer these effects to do different things as well. I'm not going to use that threshold at the moment. Let me think of some other ones that you can use in this situation. Curves is very similar to levels, actually. I think in this situation, levels is probably better. But the other thing that you can also start to play with is just kind of stacking these levels on top of each other, right? So I might want to, here's the other one that you can use. You can use the one that's called exposure, right? And what exposure gives you is it gives you exposure, offset, and gamma. So exposure is basically how bright your whites are. Offset is essentially how dark where your black point is, right? And then gamma is where your midtones sit. And so you can use this effect because basically what I'm trying to do here is bring down my midtones enough to get good dark lines that I can see really easily here. You know, because I want my blacks to stay totally black, and I want my whites to stay totally white, again, because I'm using this as a matte. And so now you can see that my levels starts to get me there, right? And then my exposure is, I can see those lines a little bit more. And now I might take another exposure and start to brighten it back up a little bit in order to get, see what I'm doing there, see how much, see how much that is kind of pushing it out. And then I might just see what these values can do for me in terms of, and so you can see that with each step of this, I'm basically adding more and more contrast, right? So this is our base image, base level of contrast, a little more contrast, additional contrast here, right? And then maybe I'll pick a levels for the last one. And then using this, you can see how much I've clamped my data, right? Like there's all these, where there used to be all of these really nice kind of variations in color, I now have only like this many colors in my entire image, right? So I can use this to start and create a cleaner mask, right? And so you can see that each step of this, I'm essentially refining, right? Theirs is pretty decent, further, and then further, right? So these are pretty nice lines now. And so what I need to do now is if I was right now to do a luma matte inverted, which I was thinking about, right? This would kind of work, but obviously I'm going to get all of the trees and stuff down here as well, which I don't necessarily want, and obviously this needs to be cleaned up quite a bit. So I'm not essentially ready to do that luma matte yet. And what I want to do is first I'm going to essentially just like do a relatively rough mask on this guy. And so I'm just going to use my pen tool and come down here and draw around it. And hopefully I later decide to speed this up so you guys don't have to watch me roto this balloon out. But I'm not being terribly precise, you know. Like the edges are kind of important, but then I might come in here, and since I know that this is all pretty okay, you know, because where I'm mostly worried about is where I start to interact with that these big gray blobs down here. So I'm probably going to want to actually maybe up here start getting a little bit tighter again so that I can clean up a lot of this gunk. That's too much. I'm going to zoom in here. First one goes there. And, you know, I'm not being necessarily super precise right now. I think that, you know, it's easier to like kind of block out the general shape, in my opinion, before you then go through and refine. Did I do that wrong? Whoops. Nope. Too far. And so this is a little bit of roto work, but that's okay, because it's going to help us clean up this edge quite a bit. And you can see, especially when I'm zoomed in at this level, how much like gunk is down here in terms of like weird color data where you have a bunch of a lot of contrast on these edges and things like that. So that's why doing something like this little bit of roto work might actually help us. Just to like kind of rule that out. And this is a tricky one. I guess I have to go higher. And by the way, the shortcut to switch to the convert anchor point tool is holding down Option or Alt when you click on it. So that's what lets me basically make a point like this. Sorry, click back on there. Make a point like this, and then after I drag it out, I can go back and modify the handles one by one or further is by holding Option there. So I'm going to hold Option here, change this so that my direction of my path changes. Come over here. And again, I can refine this matte a little bit later. It's mostly just about trying to clean up that edge. You know, we're also zoomed in at a scale that, okay, and we're basically also kind of past a lot of that stuff. And something else I could have done here would have been to use the Roto Bezier tool, which maybe we can talk about if we need to come back and clean this up. But I'm trying to keep this not super long. So bloom, bloom, bloom. And then I am going to actually just try and get kind of close because I know it's a straight line. Nice. So don't close this, right? Nice. Which is cool, except now if you guys remember, the problem is if when I turn this onto a luma matte inverted, and you can actually see what's happening, is all of the stuff back here, the sky where there's alpha because of my mask, is now gone. Or excuse me, is now showing. And that's because, again, as luma matte inverted, just as we did here, it treats transparency as like fully opaque data, which is why this sky here is fully opaque. And so the easy way to get around that is just to basically invert this image. So now we're saying, now I want my hot air balloon to be white, and I want my sky to be black, and then I want to change this from luma inverted to say luma matte, right? I want to keep where my white pixels are, and I want to hide where my black pixels or alpha is. And so you can see here that when I do that, I'm getting a pretty decent image actually, you know. And I might actually just turn this on to be able to see all of my nice little strings that I've got there. Is that you know, this didn't work too badly, right? Where I've got a decent amount of fidelity in those edges, right? So, but let's talk about really quickly a couple of different ways to refine this, right? The first one to do would be obviously just to maybe feather that little mask that I made a little bit. So I'll hit F on my keyboard and feather just a tiny little bit. I'm gonna do like 1 pixel again, just to kind of soften those edges. I don't need to do anything too crazy there, and actually I think that might actually even be too much. I'm gonna do like 0.25 just to be really careful. Okay, that feels better. And then something else that you can do is you can play with some of the refined matte tools, right? And so how you have to do that is that you first have to pre-comp this image. So if I call this balloon matted, right? Now that I have this in a pre-comp, I can use things like the chokers, right? Where I can take my simple choker, and you can see if I crunch this, it just like straight chokes that matte in and out, right? Where I can basically just say expand the whole thing or decrease the whole thing, right? And then the other, this is the simple one, and then the upgraded one is matte choker, right? Which gives you a lot of other options about like how much to smooth, how much to leave. You can see here that by playing with these little options, I can really kind of go in and start to select where I want my, that was nice. Look at that. That brings it back really nicely. You know, and if I toggle this, I don't know if you guys can even see that on the stream, but it's dealing with a lot of those little fuzzies around the outside, which is really nice. And so I'm going to continue. Yeah, there we go. That's nice. Play with that geometric softness. And now, so here's what's happening, right? Is now I feel like I have a pretty nice matte, but it's getting a little bit blurry in places, right? Like the guy himself is blurred. So what I might actually do in this situation is I might bring my image back down and use my new thing as a matte again, but this time perhaps an alpha matte, because I don't want it to look at the black and white values. I wanted to just look at the edges of the matte. Again, I've pre-comped that guy in, so now I can use this as an alpha matte. And look at that. Now I've got the best of both worlds. I have pretty well cut out strings. I have nice, not blurry images. There is a little bit of fuzz around the whole thing, as if it's a little bit soft, but I think that you know, is going to be something that I'm willing to deal with as a whole, because that is a pretty nice key on those things there. And so obviously if you wanted to from here, you come in, clean stuff up a little bit more, but that's the gist of it, right? So that's how I would recommend that you guys look at some of these different tasks. Again, is not necessarily like, okay, I need to cut this out, so let me get my pen tool and start rotoing around this. How can I use the different tools in After Effects to do that, right? We used a mask by using the pen tool. We used a luma mask. We used an alpha matte. We used all these different things to get this final result. And that's a lot of what After Effects is just layering tiny piece on top of tiny piece to eventually getting to the point where you've got something that's pretty cool. So thanks for watching. I hope this clarified some stuff. Feel free to hit me up if you have any other questions. And thank you for watching. Have a good one.